What did medieval monks really do when they weren't praying? Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter world. A world of candlelight, echoing stone corridors, and the gentle sound of quills scratching on parchment. So, if you're settling in for sleep, go ahead and loosen the blankets, dim the light, and breathe out. Because tonight, we're spending the night with medieval monks. Figuratively, of course. We tend to imagine monks as always praying, kneeling in perfect rows, muttering Latin that even they barely understood. And yes, there was a lot of praying. But between those sacred hours, they actually had quite a bit of time to fill. And, as it turns out, not all of it was especially holy. Let's drift through the cloisters and see what these quiet men actually did when they weren't saving souls. The schedule that wasn't quite as peaceful as it sounds. Most monasteries followed something called the Rule of Saint Benedict, written way back in the 6th century by a man who clearly hated sleep. According to Benedict, a good monk rose several times during the night to pray. So, imagine, you've just fallen asleep after an evening psalm, and suddenly the bell rings at 2 a.m. It's time for matins. They shuffle into the cold chapel, chanting psalms for what feels like forever, then maybe grab another hour or two of sleep before lauds, prime, terce, sext, and so on. Essentially, every few hours someone rang a bell to remind you that God was still awake and watching. But outside those scheduled prayers, there were long stretches of unsupervised time. And that's when things got interesting. The monastic to-do list. When they weren't in chapel, monks worked. Not the dramatic kind of work, no one was building cathedrals with their bare hands. They copied texts. They gardened. They brewed beer. They wrote letters to other monasteries complaining about how lazy everyone was. The copying of manuscripts gets most of the glory. We like to imagine tonsured men bent over golden pages, surrounded by halos of candlelight. In truth, it was tedious. Long hours of ink fumes and sore wrists. And because parchment was made from animal skin, the smell was memorable. Still, some monks developed genuine artistry. They decorated pages with intricate vines, shimmering gold leaf, and, occasionally, tiny drawings of rabbits playing trumpets. Which might suggest a certain creative boredom. The Holy Brewery. Many monasteries made beer or wine, not because they were party central, but because water was often unsafe. Fermentation killed most of the unpleasant microbes that medieval people couldn't name but instinctively distrusted. So yes, the average monk drank several pints a day, and yes, they were usually a bit tipsy. The official reasoning was that mild inebriation was better than dysentery. A solid theological position. Beer brewing became something of a sacred science. Some abbeys even grew famous for their ales, and a few of those brewing traditions quietly survived all the way into modern brands. So, the next time you open a Belgian Trappist beer, you're drinking a faint echo of 13th century hydration anxiety. The Gardens of God. Outside the scriptorium and brewery, monks tended gardens. Each monastery tried to be self-sufficient, so vegetables, fruit trees, and herbs were essential. There were the standard culinary plants, onions, leeks, cabbages, and the medicinal herbs, sage for memory, mint for digestion, and something called snail water, which sounded healing and probably wasn't. Tending the garden offered something monks rarely got: fresh air and privacy. Among the rows of beans and lettuce, they could mutter complaints about the abbot or daydream about their youth before celibacy. In a few surviving monastic letters, monks actually wrote about how peaceful gardening was. One even confessed that he preferred weeding to prayer, because plants do not argue. A sentiment we can all get behind. The pettiest men in the kingdom. Monasteries were also little hothouses of politics. 100 celibate men living together with strict rules and no escape. What could possibly go wrong? Petty rivalries flared over almost anything. Who got the best seat in the refectory? Who sang slightly off-key during Compline? Who stole someone's candle grease? There are recorded cases of monks writing passive-aggressive notes to each other in the margins of manuscripts. One famous complaint reads, "The brother who wrote before me was an idiot," followed later by, "Whoever wrote that is himself an idiot." Some monasteries even developed full-scale factions. One side loyal to the abbot, another to a charismatic prior, and the whole place descending into sanctified bickering. Letters to bishops from these abbeys often sound like divine soap operas. "Your Grace, Brother Thomas refuses to share the goose quails again." Secret hobbies and forbidden snacks. Rules forbade personal possessions, but monks were inventive. They hid little collections, pebbles, feathers, even fragments of colored glass, tucked under mattresses or behind chapel columns. Small contraband worlds. Food rules were also strict. Meat was mostly banned, except for the sick. So naturally, everyone was constantly unwell. Medical records from certain abbeys show astonishingly high rates of stomach weakness conveniently coinciding with feast days. There were also fast days, about half the year, actually, when dairy and eggs were forbidden. During those, monks became artists of loopholes. Fish counted as okay, so they classified beavers as fish. Because, tails. And then enjoyed a hearty roast fish with no trace of guilt. The unexpected artists. Many monks were amateur musicians. The Gregorian chant is well known, but some monasteries experimented with new melodies and instruments. The church didn't always approve. Too much rhythm was seen as dangerously close to pleasure. But human nature tends to hum when bored. There's a delightful letter from a 12th century abbot scolding his brothers for singing worldly songs. Meaning someone, somewhere, had brought a lute into the cloister and started a medieval jam session. In their defense, music was one of the few allowed joys. It was spiritual. Mostly. And it passed the time between prayers. The library that no one used. Every respectable monastery had a library. To modern eyes, that sounds noble, a beacon of learning. In reality, most monks weren't reading Aristotle by candlelight. Books were expensive and, often, in Latin so dense it could suffocate a mind. A few intellectuals did emerge, like the great scholar Bede or the meticulous copyists who preserved ancient texts. But for the average brother, reading was a duty, not a pleasure. In some monasteries, the same book was assigned to everyone at the start of Lent, to be read silently and returned by Easter. If you didn't finish, no one cared. The important part was appearing to read. Still, without these sleepy scholars, half of ancient literature might have vanished. So their boredom, ironically, became our heritage. The strange case of the monastic visitors. Every now and then, visitors arrived. Pilgrims, nobles, bishops on inspection. The monks were supposed to embody humility, but inspections often turned into judgment days. If the bishop found too much laughter, too much ale, or too many well-fed cheeks, he wrote stern reports. One 14th century visitor complained that the monks of Westminster were fat, lazy, and fond of dogs. Which sounds less like corruption and more like retirement. Still, such accusations could lead to reform, or at least a temporary show of piety. For a few weeks afterward, the beer ration would mysteriously shrink, and everyone would pretend to enjoy fasting. The occasional drama. Every so often, something more dramatic happened. A monk might run away, which, in the Middle Ages, was technically a crime. Runaway monks were hunted down like lost livestock. There's a record from the 13th century of one brother who fled to a nearby tavern, claiming he'd forgotten his vows. He was found 3 days later, drunk and quite unrepentant. The punishment was confinement and bread and water, though one imagines he considered it worth it. Then there were the visions. Monks saw things, angels, demons, occasionally both at once. Some wrote entire books describing their mystical experiences, which the church alternately celebrated or quietly ignored. Too much spiritual enthusiasm could be embarrassing. The daily meals of the cloister. Let's pause for a moment and look at dinner. Because food reveals everything. Meals were eaten in silence while one monk read aloud from scripture or, more often, from a saint's biography. Nothing whets the appetite like the story of St. Lawrence being roasted alive. The food itself was adequate. Bread, beans, cheese, maybe a little fish. Olive oil if you were lucky, lard if you weren't. And during fasts, almond milk, a surprisingly fancy medieval substitute. They sat on wooden benches, two to a platter, sharing everything, including the occasional hair that drifted in from the kitchen. But to complain would be gluttony, so everyone smiled politely and pretended to enjoy tepid pea soup. Nighttime in the monastery. As the sun set, the world grew very quiet. No candles were wasted after Compline. The monks slept in communal dormitories, wearing their habits, because pajamas hadn't been invented and modesty was eternal. There were no mattresses, just straw. And since warmth was a luxury, winter nights became a test of faith and circulation. But the darkness also brought a kind of peace. The constant chanting and chores faded away. Only the sound of the wind, and maybe someone quietly snoring through a psalm. Sometimes, a brother would wake for night prayer and find himself the only one who actually showed up. The others slept through, pretending piety at dawn. God, presumably, understood. The odd economics of piety. Monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were businesses. They owned land, collected rents, and occasionally bullied peasants with all the serene detachment of an Excel spreadsheet. Wealthy patrons donated money in exchange for prayers, an early subscription service for salvation. The richer the gift, the more enthusiastic the chanting. Some abbeys became absurdly wealthy, building stone churches so grand they contradicted every vow of poverty. One abbot in England was caught embezzling funds to buy falcons and fine horses. He argued they were necessary for the dignity of the house. Which was bold, considering the house was supposed to be humble. When holiness met hygiene. Hygiene in monasteries was better than in most medieval homes, but that isn't saying much. Baths were technically allowed. Benedict said the sick and the delicate could bathe as needed. Monks, being clever, interpreted sick broadly. Many bathed weekly. Others, seasonally. A few bragged that their odor was proof of humility. Latrines were communal, and plumbing surprisingly advanced, stone channels carrying waste away from the cloister. Which meant monasteries often smelled better than castles, though that's an exceptionally low bar. The quiet extinction of monastic life. As centuries passed, monastic enthusiasm waned. By the late Middle Ages, many orders had become complacent, wealthy, and fond of naps. Reformers appeared, accusing them of sloth and corruption. Some of those reformers were right. Others were just jealous of the beer. Eventually, Kings like Henry VIII dissolved monasteries entirely, seizing their lands and scattering the brothers. Centuries of chanting faded into silence almost overnight. But their traces remained, in libraries, in recipes, in the delicate art of brewing, and in the habit of writing things down when bored. Without them, much of history would be blank parchment. Closing drift. So, what did medieval monks really do when they weren't praying? They gardened. They brewed. They argued. They napped. They doodled rabbits in holy books. They were human, profoundly, quietly human, within walls meant to erase individuality. And perhaps that's why their world feels strangely comforting to us now. A slow rhythm, small routines, a life of repetition. Not exciting, but safe. Predictable. The kind of life that, for better or worse, lets the mind finally rest. Let's drift, then, out of the cloister, past the worn stones, and into the night air. The bells are silent now. The candles have burned low. And their monks, those weary, slightly tipsy scribes, are finally asleep, the pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens in history. Hey everyone. Welcome back. If you're still awake, impressive. If you've already drifted off, don't worry, you're missing nothing urgent. Just another quiet parade of royal disasters. Tonight, we're gently wandering through the candlelit corridors of history's most gloriously petty kings and queens. People born to rule entire nations, but somehow unable to manage their tempers, their families, or, in many cases, their trousers. Because while peasants were busy surviving, royalty was busy sulking. So, let's dim the lights a little more, and start with a man whose ego was roughly the size of his empire, and almost as fragile. Charles VI of France, the mad king who forgot who he was. Charles VI began his reign in 1380. He was handsome, young, and, for about 5 minutes, sane. But stress, inbreeding, and probably lead poisoning had other plans. One day, while leading his army, Charles suddenly turned on his own men and started attacking them, screaming that he was being betrayed. When the dust settled, several knights were dead. Charles had to be tackled and carried away. That was the beginning of what we now call a bad reign. He developed strange delusions, once convinced he was made of glass. He refused to let people touch him for fear of shattering. He had iron rods sewn into his clothes, just in case. Which sounds uncomfortable but, you know, safety first. Courtiers had to tiptoe around him, both literally and politically. France effectively ran itself through regents, factions, and endless infighting, while the king sat quietly, certain he was transparent. It's tragic, yes. But also quite on brand for medieval monarchy, fragile men wrapped in metal. Queen Joanna of Castile, La Loca, or just deeply unlucky. Next, let's drift to Spain, where we find Queen Joanna, better known as Juana La Loca, Joanna the Mad. She wasn't actually mad. Mostly just heartbroken and trapped in a dynastic nightmare. Her husband, Philip the Handsome, was, as the name implies, handsome. And also a monumental narcissist. He flirted with every woman at court. Joanna didn't take it well. She allegedly screamed, cried, and once attacked a rival lady with a pair of scissors. After Philip died suddenly, Joanna refused to bury him. She traveled across the countryside with his coffin, opening it occasionally to check he was still there. Historians debate whether that's madness or just very committed denial. Her family, conveniently, used it as an excuse to lock her away for life. Which, in royal circles, was the preferred way of solving family arguments. So Joanna spent decades imprisoned in a cold castle, occasionally singing lullabies to a husband who, unfortunately, wasn't listening. Emperor Nero, Rome's original drama queen. And now we drift back in time, to ancient Rome. Emperor Nero, the man, the myth, the musical disaster. Nero fancied himself an artist, a poet, a singer, a man of refined taste. Which was unfortunate, because Rome wanted an emperor, not a theater major. He forced the elite to attend his endless performances. People literally pretended to die just to escape. There are stories of women giving birth in the audience and still being unable to leave. He also had a small problem with humility. He once erected a 100-foot statue of himself called the Colossus of Nero. Because of course he did. When Rome burned in 64 AD, rumors said he played the lyre and sang of the city's fall. Historians aren't sure if it's true, but it feels true, doesn't it? Because if anyone would sing while everything collapsed, it was Nero. Eventually, the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. He fled, panicked, and, realizing his reign was over, famously muttered, "What an artist dies in me." Then he died. A little melodramatically, naturally. King Henry VIII, the marital menace. Back in England, we find Henry VIII. A man whose solution to any problem, political, romantic, or theological, was usually execute someone. He started out charming, athletic, full of promise. Then he turned into a paranoid tyrant with 6 wives and the patience of a toddler. Catherine of Aragon? Divorced. Anne Boleyn? Beheaded. Jane Seymour? Died in childbirth, which probably saved her. Anne of Cleves? Divorced again. Catherine Howard? Beheaded again. Catherine Parr? Survived, though barely. Each relationship began as passion and ended as paperwork or bloodshed. Henry blamed women for failing to give him sons, conveniently ignoring the biology of the situation. By middle age, he was obese, ulcerous, and increasingly convinced of his own righteousness. He even passed laws making it treason to criticize his marriages, which, to be fair, saved a lot of awkward dinner conversations. When he died, his court reportedly rejoiced quietly. And his coffin, as it was being moved, leaked onto the church floor. Chroniclers claim dogs licked up the mess, which somehow feels like cosmic justice. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, the original Instagram queen. Next, let's drift into the 19th century. The age of trains, corsets, and extreme emotional repression. Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, was beautiful, melancholy, and deeply obsessed with her appearance. She spent hours brushing her famously long hair, used ice baths to stay thin, and wrote angsty poetry about loneliness. Her husband, Emperor Franz Joseph, adored her, from a respectful emotional distance of about 6 miles. Court life bored her. She hated ceremonies, refused to eat with people, and traveled constantly to avoid social interaction. In many ways, she was the first influencer, living for image, fleeing from reality. She dieted, posed, complained, and recorded her sadness for posterity. And like many influencers, she met a tragic end, assassinated by an anarchist while out for a casual stroll. Even in death, her waist measured 19 inches. Her legacy, a strange mixture of glamour, grief, and a warning about taking too many mirror selfies without supervision. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the dreamer who bankrupted himself on castles. Speaking of lonely royals with aesthetic problems, meet King Ludwig II. He ruled Bavaria in the 19th century and cared deeply about 2 things. Richard Wagner's operas. building fantasy castles. He adored Wagner, calling him a genius and possibly imagining himself one too. He spent enormous sums constructing fairy tale palaces inspired by myths and moonlight, including the famous Neuschwanstein Castle. It looks like something from Disney because, in fact, Disney copied it. Unfortunately, Ludwig funded all this with money he didn't have. The government eventually declared him insane, largely because they were broke. He was arrested and sent to a lakeside asylum, where he mysteriously drowned the next day. Officially an accident, unofficially suspicious. His castles still stand, though, dreamy monuments to financial irresponsibility and creative escapism. If you've ever fantasized about buying a mansion you can afford, Ludwig understands you. Catherine the Great, a queen with rumors she definitely did not deserve. Catherine the Great of Russia ruled brilliantly for decades. But you wouldn't know it from her reputation. Because people preferred to gossip about her love life. The famous rumor, the one involving a horse, was entirely false, invented by her political enemies after her death. But it spread faster than fire in a hayloft, because history, much like the internet, has always been trashy. In truth, Catherine was intelligent, pragmatic, and mildly terrifying. She corresponded with philosophers, modernized her empire, and occasionally had her lovers promoted to generals, which, in fairness, was efficient. She kept portraits of her favorites, often younger men with good cheekbones and limited intelligence. When one relationship ended, she gave them estates and pensions, as if to say, "Thank you for your service." Russia under Catherine expanded massively, its art and culture flourished, and its gossip column exploded. Not bad for someone constantly fighting sexist propaganda, and probably insomnia. King George III, the gentleman who talked to trees. Over in Britain again, King George III was, at first, a competent and well-meaning ruler. He cared deeply for his family, read widely, and wore simple clothes. Then, gradually, his mind unraveled. He began talking to himself for hours. Held long conversations with imaginary people. And yes, at one point, with an oak tree, reportedly believing it to be the King of Prussia. His doctors, with the best 18th century medical wisdom available, treated him with leeches, purges, and confinement. Surprisingly, none of that helped. His illness, probably porphyria, turned him into both a national tragedy and a medical experiment. Through it all, his wife, Queen Charlotte, remained loyal, though quietly relieved when he was finally declared unfit to rule. He lived for years in gentle confusion, muttering prayers and apologies, unaware his empire was changing without him. A melancholy reminder that crowns don't protect minds. Marie Antoinette, misquoted, misunderstood, and mildly misled. Marie Antoinette has gone down in history for supposedly saying, "Let them eat cake." She didn't. It was a rumor spread decades earlier about someone else. But her actual life wasn't much better. Married as a teenager to Louis XVI, she found herself trapped in the world's most awkward arranged marriage. Her husband was shy, indecisive, and famously uninterested in his wife for the first 7 years. Which, for a queen expected to produce heirs, was problematic. She filled the emotional gap with clothes. Extravagant, absurd clothes. At Versailles, she built a pretend village where she could play shepherdess, complete with fake cows and fresh milk served on porcelain. The public, starving and angry, didn't appreciate the whimsy. When the revolution came, she faced it with quiet dignity, though it was far too late. She was executed at 37, leaving behind a legacy of pearls, rumors, and unfortunate quotes she never uttered. King Charles II of Spain, the genetic dead end. And finally, let's drift to Spain again, where the Habsburg dynasty reached its biological conclusion. Charles II, known as Lh's Otto, the Bewitched, was the result of centuries of royal inbreeding. His family tree was less a tree and more a circle. He was sickly from birth, with a jaw so deformed he could barely chew, and intellect delayed well into adulthood. He could not speak until age 4, could not walk until 8, and never fathered children. His courtiers whispered that he was cursed. In reality, genetics had simply given up. When he died childless in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, along with much of Europe's tolerance for cousin marriage. His autopsy reportedly revealed his body did not contain a single healthy organ. A fitting symbol for a dynasty that had imploded under its own DNA. The royal moral, if there is one. So, what do we learn from all this noble chaos? That crowns don't guarantee composure. That power magnifies pettiness. And that the people who ruled half the world were often less functional than the average villager with a good goat and a clean conscience. Yet, their flaws made them unforgettable. Mad kings, lonely queens, overdecorated dreamers. Their vanity gave us art, architecture, and endless bedtime stories. And in the end, maybe that's their quiet redemption, not in how they ruled, but in how completely, wonderfully human they were. So rest easy, dear listener. You could not possibly be as dysfunctional as the crowned heads of Europe. And if you are, at least you're not funding your emotional turmoil with taxes. Sickly, spoiled, and sad, medieval royal childhoods. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting into a quieter part of royal history. Not the wars. Not the crowns. Just the childhoods. Because for every glorious portrait of a medieval king, there's a small, pale child behind it, one who probably hadn't been allowed to run in the mud or play tag without at least 2 nights watching. Royal children were born to rule, but almost never born to be happy. They were treated like political investments, swaddled, guarded, and occasionally forgotten. So, if you're cozy and settled in, let's pull back the velvet curtains and peek into the childhood bedrooms of Europe's tiniest monarchs and heirs. Born to be important and immediately terrified. In most medieval courts, a royal birth wasn't a private affair. It was a public event, a crowd of midwives, nobles, servants, and courtiers all jammed into the room to verify the baby's legitimacy. Imagine your first moments on Earth being witnessed by 20 strangers arguing about your father's chin. If you were lucky, you were declared healthy. If not, you were quietly ignored, because kings needed heirs, not heartbreaks. Some royal infants never even received names until they'd survived a few weeks. Statistically, many didn't. And if you did survive? Congratulations. You now belong to the realm, not your parents. Tiny thrones and heavy expectations. From birth, royal children were treated as miniature adults. The crown was never patient. By age 4 or 5, they were assigned tutors to teach them Latin, manners, and how to sit very still while being stared at. They learned to read prayers before they could spell their own names. Playtime was limited, unless it involved pretending to judge peasants. One chronicler described young Prince Edward, later Edward III of England, as grave beyond his years. Which probably meant he'd already learned that smiling was suspicious. Even toys were political. Little wooden knights, miniature castles, early training tools for conquest. No teddy bears, though. unless you count actual taxidermied bears, which some royal children did, alarmingly enough. The Great Separation, childhood without parents. Royal parents rarely raised their own children. As soon as a baby could be weaned, they were handed over to a household, a small army of nurses, servants, and tutors who effectively became their family. Kings and queens might visit occasionally, like distant celebrities checking on their fan mail. Henry II of England once went a full decade without seeing his children. He was busy ruling and fighting, and occasionally being a terrible father. So, royal affection came from whoever was nearest. Wet nurses, governesses, servants, all the people who'd later be fired the moment the child turned 12. It wasn't exactly nurturing, but it did create a certain emotional resilience. Or, in many cases, lifelong trust issues. The royal nursery, equal parts luxury and cold drafts. The rooms themselves were elegant, but not comfortable. Tapestries on the walls, carved cradles, soft linens, and absolutely no warmth. Castles were cold, damp, and full of echoing footsteps. Servants kept fires burning, but smoke made everyone cough. Windows were covered in oiled parchment instead of glass. So, on windy nights, the future King of France might lie awake, listening to the wind whistle through his destiny. Meals were strict, even for children. No sweets except on feast days, and even then, everything came with moral lessons about moderation. The only thing they were allowed to indulge in was anxiety. Education by fear and grammar. Royal education wasn't designed for joy. It was designed for obedience. Lessons began early and lasted all day: Latin, scripture, history, and something called courtly comportment, which mainly involved not doing anything human in public. Teachers didn't use gold stars. They used sticks. There are surviving records of princes being beaten for yawning during prayers. So if you're getting sleepy right now, congratulations, you'd be an excellent medieval student. Some royal tutors took a gentler approach. But the general idea was to remind a young heir that the entire kingdom depended on them not being an idiot. No pressure. Princess problems, raised to marry, not to rule. For royal daughters, the situation was even less cheerful. From infancy, they were political currency, beautiful bargaining chips wrapped in lace. By age 6, they were taught embroidery, piety, and how to look grateful when being promised to a foreign prince twice their age. By age 12, they were often engaged. By 15, married. By 16, sometimes widowed. One princess of Hungary was married off so young that her nurses had to accompany her to her husband's bedchamber just to explain what was happening. No one thought this was odd. Education for girls rarely included strategy or law, unless they were lucky enough to have an ambitious mother. Mostly, it focused on charm, silence, and the ability to feign attractively in church. The fragility of royal bodies. Medieval royalty had all the food they wanted, but none of the science. And centuries of inbreeding didn't help. Many royal children were born sickly, with immune systems as delicate as the lace on their sleeves. Diseases swept through palaces constantly: measles, smallpox, plague, mysterious fevers that might have just been bad water. Doctors, of course, made it worse. The cure for almost everything involved leeches, purges, or a brisk bleeding. One French prince reportedly survived 11 therapeutic bleedings in 1 week. He then died, shockingly. Royal parents usually responded by ordering more prayers, or blaming the nearest astrologer. Because obviously, the stars were the real problem. The loneliest playdates in history. Socializing for royal children was complicated. They couldn't play with commoners, too dirty. Couldn't play with siblings, too dangerous for succession. So, they were paired with carefully chosen companions, usually noble children of slightly lower rank. These playmates were also spies for their families, reporting everything the young prince said. Which must have made hide-and-seek awkward. Occasionally, real friendships developed. But more often, they ended abruptly when someone's father rebelled against the crown. The medieval version of being unfriended, with swords. Henry VI, the boy who inherited too soon. Let's pause with a specific example, Henry VI of England. He became king at 9 months old. Which, understandably, made governing tricky. For years, England was run by regents while baby Henry lay in a cradle, drooling on the concept of monarchy. By the time he came of age, he'd been raised in total isolation, surrounded by tutors who drilled him on virtue but forgot to teach him how to rule people. He grew up gentle, kind, and catastrophically indecisive. When rebellion broke out, he reportedly fainted at the news. At one point, he lapsed into a catatonic state for over a year, his wife running the kingdom in his place. It's hard not to feel sorry for him. He never wanted power. He just inherited a family job no one could quit. The education of a prince, by paranoia. By adolescence, royal heirs were expected to act regal, which mainly meant distrusting everyone. Courtiers flattered them. Relatives plotted against them. Servants listened too closely. One wrong friendship could end a dynasty. So, most heirs learned to keep their thoughts private, their emotions guarded, and their smiles strategic. Many turned cold before they even wore crowns. Emotion wasn't weakness, it was a liability. By the time they ruled, they'd forgotten how to feel anything other than suspicion. It's no wonder that so many kings later turned cruel. They'd been raised without kindness, and then expected to rule with wisdom. The joys of discipline and dietary regret. Royal health regimens were their own quiet torture. Physicians recommended early rising, frequent prayer, limited meat, and regular bleeding, because why not? Young Louis XIII of France's daily schedule, written by his physician, included light breakfast, moderate walking, limited emotion, and avoidance of imagination. So basically, the opposite of childhood. Desserts were discouraged. Baths were suspiciously optional. And the ideal prince was pale, pious, and permanently constipated. If they showed too much energy, it was treated as illness. If they showed too little, divine punishment. It's a miracle any of them survived long enough to reproduce, though, unfortunately, many did. The royal childhoods that never ended. Some kings never emotionally graduated from childhood. Because when you grow up surrounded by servants saying yes, you never learn to hear no. Louis XIV, for example, was crowned at age 5. He grew up believing the world revolved around him, and later built Versailles to make sure everyone else believed it too. He called himself the Sun King, which feels modest compared to how he actually behaved. He threw temper tantrums when servants touched his clothes incorrectly. He made courtiers watch him eat breakfast like it was theater. Essentially, he stayed a child, just with better wigs. Royal adulthood, for many, was just royal childhood with crowns and taxes. The daughters who remembered. Occasionally, a princess remembered her lonely childhood and tried to change things. Queen Isabella of Castile educated her daughters thoroughly, languages, politics, theology, insisting they be more than ornaments. One of those daughters became Catherine of Aragon, who famously refused to quietly disappear when Henry VIII demanded a divorce. That steel came from her mother. So maybe, sometimes, a lonely childhood did produce strength. A hard kind of wisdom. A determination not to be invisible. But for most royal children, the cycle continued. Born into golden cages. Raised by strangers. Married to strangers. And remembered only for the wars their parents started. A quiet reflection before sleep. So, as we drift toward the end of the night, it's worth pausing for a small, sleepy thought. Royal childhoods were not fairy tales. They were rehearsals for power, isolating, suffocating, and painfully adult. They gave us brilliant rulers and broken ones, martyrs and tyrants. And almost all of them started with a frightened child, wrapped in silk, listening to footsteps echoing in the hall. If you're lying awake tonight, worrying about ordinary things, bills, laundry, the general chaos of existence, remember that even the future kings of Europe once lay awake too. Worrying about Latin lessons and destiny. And, occasionally, ghosts in the corridor. So breathe out. You're not missing anything in those castles. Just a few sad little heirs trying very hard not to disappoint history. Sleep well, commoner or not. Your childhood, statistically, was better. Royal marriages that went horribly, genetically wrong. Hey everyone. Welcome back. Tonight, we're dimming the lights and wandering into one of history's more ill-advised hobbies, marrying your cousin. Because for centuries, Europe's royal families were less like separate nations and more like a single, very confused family reunion that never ended. Everyone wanted pure bloodlines. Which, ironically, led to some of the most impure genetic situations imaginable. So, settle in. Get comfortable. And let's drift through the candlelit banquet halls where royal romance met biology, and biology quietly gave up. The great royal dating pool or, the lack thereof. The problem started with ambition. When you're king or queen, you can't just marry anyone. You need alliances, people with land, titles, and armies. Unfortunately, the only people who had those things were your relatives. So, generation after generation, royal families kept arranging marriages between cousins, nieces, nephews, and, occasionally, uncomfortably close in-laws. All in the name of dynastic unity. By the 1500s, the family trees of Europe's monarchies looked less like trees and more like tangled necklaces. It wasn't so much who are you marrying, as how many times are you already related? Charles II of Spain, the poster child of poor decisions. Let's begin with the tragic masterpiece of royal genetics, Charles II of Spain. Charles was the last Habsburg king of Spain, a dynasty famous for their enormous empires, impressive chins, and catastrophic chromosomes. By the time Charles was born in 1661, his family had been intermarrying for over 200 years. His father was his mother's uncle. And both were descendants of the same set of grandparents, several times over. Charles inherited the full jackpot of recessive genes. He was physically deformed, chronically ill, and mentally delayed. Contemporaries called him Otto, the Bewitched, because, frankly, no one could explain how he was still alive. He couldn't chew properly. He drooled constantly. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8. And his tongue was so large that speech was nearly impossible. Doctors tried everything: leeches, exorcisms, pilgrimages. Nothing worked, because, unfortunately, what he needed was new DNA. Charles married twice, but had no children. By the time he died at 39, his family's genetic line simply ended. Spain's empire collapsed into war, and Europe quietly realized that maybe, just maybe, cousin marriage had gone too far. The Habsburg jaw, a family crest in bone. The Habsburg dynasty's most famous feature wasn't their crown, or their empire, or their tendency to start wars. It was their jawline, the so-called Habsburg jaw. It began subtly. A little protrusion here. A slightly underdeveloped upper lip there. And after a few more generations of intermarriage, their faces began to resemble the architecture of their palaces, grand, but not entirely functional. By the 1600s, portraits of the Habsburgs showed lips that didn't close and chins that looked like geological formations. Yet, in family portraits, everyone smiled proudly, as if genetics were a matter of national pride. It wasn't vanity, it was politics. Each marriage tightened the grip of dynastic power, and simultaneously ensured that their descendants would struggle to eat soup. The Medici experiment, rich, brilliant, and biologically unstable. Over in Italy, the Medici family took a similar approach. They weren't technically royal at first, just absurdly rich. But they married strategically, and by the 1500s they were producing dukes, queens, and a steady supply of medical curiosities. The Medici suffered from everything: gout, rickets, and enough hereditary madness to fill several operas. One branch produced so many sickly children that the family physician declared their blood too noble to circulate properly. Which was a poetic way of saying you need to marry someone new. Naturally, they didn't. Marrying for love or political leverage. Now, not all royal marriages were purely genetic gambles. Occasionally, a king would insist on marrying for love, which, historically, ended just as badly. Take Henry VIII of England. He wasn't particularly inbred, but he was deeply indecisive. 6 marriages, 2 executions, and 1 entire religious schism later, England had plenty of heirs and even more trauma. His daughter Mary married her cousin Philip of Spain, yes, another Habsburg, and the cycle of poor choices resumed. They were technically double cousins, meaning they shared all 4 grandparents. Their marriage produced no children, but did produce widespread misery in England, so, partial success. Cleopatra and Ptolemaic Egypt, keeping it in the family, aggressively. Let's drift back a few centuries to Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, took family loyalty to the extreme. They ruled for almost 300 years, and for most of that time, they married their own siblings. Not cousins. Actual brothers and sisters. Because, as they claimed, the gods did it first. The Ptolemies believed sibling marriage preserved divine blood. It also preserved a range of medical conditions modern historians can politely describe as interesting. By the time Cleopatra VII, yes, the Cleopatra, came along, her family tree was more like a wreath. She was intelligent, charismatic, and physically healthy by comparison, but several of her siblings weren't so lucky. One was reportedly unable to speak clearly, another died young under mysterious court circumstances. Cleopatra, of course, broke the pattern by partnering with Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony. Which, politically speaking, was an upgrade, genetically, perhaps less so. But at least she tried. The Bourbon Blues, Fragile Sons and Worrisome Blood. Moving ahead to 18th century France, we find the Bourbon dynasty, polished, powdered, and perilously frail. Louis XIV, the Sun King, married his first cousin. Their children married cousins. Their grandchildren married cousins. And by the time you reached Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the family's bloodline was about as robust as a lace handkerchief. Louis XVI himself was reportedly shy, clumsy, and uninterested in his wife, at least for the first 7 years. Contemporary doctors wrote long, delicate reports about his personal difficulties. Modern historians tend to summarize with one phrase: the Habsburg problem persists. Their children suffered too. Their son, the Dauphin, died at age 7 from tuberculosis, not unusual, but symbolic. By the time revolution came, France's royal genes were just as exhausted as its treasury. The tragic tale of the Romanovs. And then there were the Romanovs, Russia's imperial family. At first glance, they seemed healthy, tall, and proud. But like most European dynasties, they were tangled up in the same extended gene pool. When Tsar Nicholas II married Alexandra of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, they unknowingly imported a genetic time bomb, hemophilia. The disease prevented blood from clotting properly, turning even small bruises into life-threatening injuries. Their only son, Alexei, inherited it. He spent much of his childhood bedridden, wrapped in layers of secrecy and prayer. Desperate for help, Alexandra turned to mystics and faith healers, one of whom was Rasputin. And from there, things unraveled quickly. A bleeding disorder became a national scandal, and eventually, a revolution. So yes, a royal marriage that went horribly, genetically wrong, and politically catastrophic. Queen Victoria, the great genetic distributor. Speaking of hemophilia, it all began with Queen Victoria herself. She was a carrier of the gene and, thanks to her numerous children and grandchildren, spread it across almost every royal house in Europe. Her descendants ruled Britain, Russia, Spain, and Germany, and carried her recessive gift with them. Hemophilia appeared in the Russian, Spanish, and German courts like an uninvited dinner guest. It was so common it became known as the royal disease. In polite society, that phrase meant we're all related, and it's starting to show. Victoria herself, of course, was delighted with her family's reach. She called them her dear little dynasty. The rest of Europe called them the cousins, and occasionally, the problem. Inbreeding depression, the quiet decline of majesty. As generations passed, the effects of inbreeding became harder to ignore. Infant mortality soared. Heirs were stillborn. Those who survived were often weak, infertile, or plagued by mysterious ailments. Royal doctors, baffled, blamed everything from melancholy vapors to divine punishment. None suspected that the issue was simply math. Too few ancestors. Too many repeated chromosomes. When scientists later studied the Habsburg lineage, they discovered that Charles II of Spain had a level of inbreeding equivalent to being the child of a brother and sister. Statistically, he shouldn't have existed. But, in true royal fashion, he persevered, badly. When cousins marry cousins of cousins. By the 1800s, royal genealogies had reached a kind of bureaucratic absurdity. Family gatherings at Windsor or Vienna were essentially international summits. Everyone called everyone else Your Majesty and dear cousin. Queen Victoria's granddaughter married the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. Another married the Russian Tsar. Another married the King of Spain. And when World War I broke out, it was Quite literally, a family argument that killed 20 million people. So yes, in the end, the greatest consequence of royal intermarriage wasn't deformity or disease. It was geopolitics. A web of bloodlines that pulled the world into disaster, all because a few families couldn't imagine marrying anyone new. Lessons unlearned. Even into the 20th century, royals struggled to let go of tradition. Marrying commoners was scandalous. Marrying outsiders was unthinkable. But gradually, the walls came down. Princesses began marrying soldiers, actors, and, occasionally, people they actually liked. The gene pool widened, and humanity breathed a quiet sigh of relief. Though, if you look closely at some modern royal portraits, you can still trace the faint echoes, the same eyes, the same noses, the same tendency toward historical irony. It took centuries for them to realize that true nobility isn't in the blood. It's in not fainting at the sight of new DNA. A gentle closing thought. So, as you drift off tonight, think of all those grand weddings, the gold-threaded gowns, the velvet cloaks, the trembling hands signing treaties that doubled as marriage licenses. Behind all the splendor were fragile bodies, tired lineages, and families slowly folding inward. Kings and queens who feared the outside world so much, they trapped themselves inside their own bloodlines. And all the while, history looked on, amused, horrified, and occasionally sympathetic. Because, really, it's hard not to feel a little sorry for them. All that power. All that silk. And not one person brave enough to suggest, maybe try someone from the next village over. Sleep well, my friend. And be grateful that your family tree, hopefully, looks more like a tree, and less like a circle. The most inbred monarchs in European history. Hey everyone. Welcome back. Tonight, we're going to drift even deeper into the royal gene pool. And, fair warning, it's very shallow here. We've talked about bad royal marriages, tragic heirs, and dynastic decline. Now we arrive at the logical conclusion of all that, the kings and queens who were, quite literally, too related for their own good. So, if you're lying in bed, lights low, maybe a cup of tea on the nightstand, just breathe slowly. And let's fall gently through the centuries, into a world where cousin weddings were considered diplomacy, and the family tree had fewer branches than a broomstick. When the bloodlines curled inward. The obsession began with fear, fear of outsiders, fear of losing the throne, fear of tainting the royal line. So, Europe's monarchs decided that the best way to preserve their purity was to marry each other. Over and over. It's a little like photocopying the same picture until it starts to blur. At first, you don't notice. But by the 10th copy, everyone's eyes are a bit lopsided and the background looks like soup. That was European royalty by the 17th century. Still glamorous. Still gilded. But underneath the lace and velvet, genetic chaos. Charles II of Spain, the gold medalist in inbreeding. We can't avoid starting with him. Charles II of Spain was, by all reasonable accounts, the most inbred monarch in recorded European history. Born in 1661, Charles was the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. Which sounds respectable, until you look at the family chart. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were cousins. And his great-grandparents were also cousins. In total, Charles had fewer distinct ancestors over 8 generations than most people have in 3. Modern geneticists estimate his inbreeding coefficient at 0.25, the equivalent of being the child of a brother and sister. Which explains a lot. Charles was fragile, small, and severely disfigured. His tongue was so large that he struggled to speak or swallow. He drooled constantly, could barely chew, and his jaw jutted so far forward that closing his mouth was considered an achievement. He suffered epileptic fits, intestinal problems, infertility, and bouts of what doctors called melancholia, which today we might just call the Habsburg experience. When he died in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, and the War of Spanish Succession began. It took half of Europe to decide who got to clean up after centuries of genetic enthusiasm. Charles remains, in every sense, the poster child of royal inbreeding. If there had been a trophy, it would have been gold, but inherited. Joanna of Castile, La Loca, and the madness that wasn't entirely hers. Before Charles, there was Joanna of Castile, better known as Joanna the Mad. Born in 1479, she was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who financed Columbus and unified Spain. Joanna inherited their empire, their faith, and their genes. Her parents were second cousins, part of the Trastamara dynasty, which had been intermarrying for generations. Joanna married Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg. A man so charming and faithless that he might have driven anyone a little mad. When he died suddenly, Joanna refused to let him go. Literally. She kept his embalmed body with her for years, traveling with it from town to town, opening the coffin periodically to check if he was still there. Historians once called it madness. Modern scholars, less cruelly, call it trauma, combined with an unfortunate family tendency toward depression and paranoia. Her son was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Her grandson was Philip II. And from there, the genetic spiral accelerated. The Austrian Habsburgs, where jaws went to war with faces. If you've ever seen a portrait of a Habsburg and thought, that chin seems committed, you're not wrong. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs ran parallel to the Spanish one, and they weren't much healthier. Take Leopold I, who ruled from 1658 to 1705. He had a jaw so enormous that diplomats struggled not to stare. His head was slightly misshapen, his spine curved, and his lips never quite met in conversation. He married 3 times, all cousins, and his children continued the tradition. One of his sons, Joseph I, died young of smallpox. Another, Charles VI, survived but produced only 2 daughters. One of them, Maria Theresa, married her cousin Francis of Lorraine. And yes, their children carried the famous chin too. The Habsburg jaw became more than a family trait. It was practically a logo, passed down like a coat of arms, sculpted by centuries of strategic bad decisions. The Wittelsbachs, Bavaria's beautiful nightmares. Let's drift north to Bavaria. The Wittelsbach dynasty was known for its wealth, its art collections, and its eccentricity, which, as you might guess, had a hereditary component. One of the most famous Wittelsbachs was King Ludwig II, the man who built Neuschwanstein Castle, that fairy tale fortress in the Alps. Ludwig was tall, handsome, and wildly romantic. He preferred opera to politics, and swans to people. He was also mentally unstable, prone to hallucinations, grandiose delusions, and long conversations with imaginary friends. The Wittelsbachs had a long history of mental illness. His cousin, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, suffered from severe depression and eating disorders. Another cousin was institutionalized for life. And several earlier generations had quietly retired to monasteries for spiritual reflection, which was code for nervous breakdown. Was it genetic? Probably. Was it avoidable? Absolutely not, if you're determined to only marry your relatives. The Bourbons of Spain, still Habsburging, long after the Habsburgs. When the Bourbon dynasty replaced the Spanish Habsburgs in the early 1700s, people sighed with relief. New blood at last. Fresh genes. Maybe even a chin that ends before the collarbone. Unfortunately, the Bourbons were related to the French royal family, who were themselves descended from the Habsburgs. So the fresh start was, genetically speaking, more of a sequel. Take Ferdinand VII, King of Spain in the early 1800s. He was the great-great-grandson of Charles II's relatives and inherited much of the family's delightful instability. He was paranoid, cruel, and erratic, reportedly swinging between weeping fits and violent rages over dinner. His first 3 wives, all cousins, died childless. His fourth, also related, finally produced an heir. And thus, the Bourbon bloodline continued, still wobbling slightly, but upright. The Portuguese royals, cousins in a small country. Portugal was smaller, but no less committed to intra-family matrimony. The House of Braganza, ruling from the 1600s onward, frequently intermarried with Spanish and Austrian relatives. Which meant they, too, were swimming in the same genetic puddle. King Pedro II married his own niece, Maria Sofia. Their son, João V, inherited the family's delicate health and migraines so severe that he was bedridden for months. By the 1800s, the family line had produced Pedro IV, who married a cousin and promptly had 2 epileptic children. There's a tragic pattern here, the royal desire for legitimacy slowly eroding the very thing it sought to protect, survival. The Stuarts, Scotland's self-sabotage. The Stuarts of Scotland weren't quite as inbred as the Habsburgs, but they certainly flirted with the idea. James I of England, formerly James VI of Scotland, was the great-grandson of Henry VII of England and thus already half Tudor, half Stuart, and roughly a quarter what happens when you mix cousins across borders. By the time we reached Charles I and his sons, the family showed signs of the same subtle genetic fatigue, weak chins, bad teeth, and a disturbing number of stillbirths. When Charles II the English one this time came to power, he left no legitimate heirs, only numerous illegitimate ones, perhaps nature's way of quietly pressing the reset button. Queen Victoria's legacy, the family that couldn't stop. Of course, the crown jewel of pan-European inbreeding was Queen Victoria's extended family. She and Prince Albert were first cousins, both grandchildren of Francis, Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Their marriage was genuinely affectionate, which was unusual and, unfortunately, still not great for genetic diversity. They had 9 children, who married into almost every royal house on the continent. As a result, by the early 1900s, the kings of Britain, Germany, Russia, Norway, Greece, Spain, and Romania were all blood relatives. When World War I broke out, it was literally a family feud conducted by telegram. George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were first cousins, and all bore strikingly similar beards. They also shared Victoria's recessive gene for hemophilia, which haunted royal nurseries from St. Petersburg to Madrid. It's said that by the time Victoria's great-grandchildren were born, you could travel across Europe and find portraits of people who all looked faintly like each other, pale, melancholy, with that same slightly bewildered expression of someone realizing they've been related to everyone at dinner. The modern echoes. By the 20th century, even monarchies began to notice the problem. Medical science caught up with family trees. And royal advisors started whispering the unthinkable: perhaps it was time to marry outside the club. King Harald of Norway married a commoner, Sonja Haraldsson. Prince Rainier of Monaco married Grace Kelly. And the British royal family, to their quiet credit, began branching out, if cautiously. Modern royal bloodlines are far more diverse now, which is probably why you don't see any more hereditary chins large enough to cast a shadow. But the ghosts of those genetic centuries linger, in the portraits, in the stories, and in the strange, melancholy humor of it all. A soft good night among crowns. So, as you drift off, imagine those royal families sitting by candlelight. Each wedding a treaty. Each christening a strategic investment. Generation after generation, all in the name of purity, until the line grew so pure it nearly disappeared. They were the rulers of half the world, yet they couldn't escape their own reflections. The same eyes. The same jaw. The same fragile blood, chasing itself in circles. And maybe there's something a little human, and quietly tragic, in that. Because beneath the crowns and titles, they were just families. Complicated, proud, and very bad at choosing partners. Sleep well tonight, knowing you come from a far healthier gene pool. And be grateful that your ancestors, at some point, looked beyond the castle walls. The pettiest feuds in royal history, crowns, cousins, and completely pointless wars. Hey everyone. Welcome back. If you're still awake, that's either impressive or slightly concerning. But either way, tonight we're drifting through another dimly lit hallway of royal nonsense, this time, the long, proud, and entirely pointless tradition of royal feuds. You know, the kind that started because someone sat in the wrong chair at a banquet, and ended with several thousand dead peasants, a burnt-down village, and two monarchs insisting they'd won. Because when your bloodline goes back to Charlemagne, or so you claim, you can apparently justify anything. So, get comfortable. Maybe light a candle. Maybe you don't, for safety reasons. And let's drift back to a time when crowns were heavy, tempers were short, and everyone was technically someone's cousin. We'll begin, as we often do, in England. Because no one did petty royal feuds quite like the English. Specifically, we're going to visit the Plantagenets, a family tree so tangled it looked like it had been dropped, trampled, and then reassembled by someone who'd never seen a tree before. Take King Henry II, for example. He had 4 sons. They all hated each other. They also all hated him. And, occasionally, they hated their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, though to be fair, Eleanor occasionally hated all of them too. The family dinners were probably tense. Henry's sons spent most of their adult lives rebelling against their father, sometimes together, sometimes against one another, and usually for reasons that would not impress a modern therapist. The young King Henry, crowned while his father was still alive, because medieval monarchs thought sharing power was a great idea, rebelled because he didn't get enough control over his territories. His brother Richard the Lionheart joined him. Their mother, Eleanor, quietly funded the rebellion from the side. And when that failed, everyone just pretended it hadn't happened and moved on. Until the next one. When Henry II finally died, exhausted, betrayed, and probably regretting every decision since 1154, Richard took the throne. Naturally, he spent almost no time ruling. He went on crusade instead, got kidnapped, and then ransomed back by his brother John, who'd spent that time plotting to take the throne for himself. Richard eventually returned, forgave John in the most passive-aggressive royal pardon imaginable, and died in France after being shot by a crossbow bolt during a siege. John then took over, and managed to alienate everyone in the kingdom so thoroughly that his nobles forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which, ironically, became one of the most important documents in English history. All because John was not a people person. So that's one family feud, spanning generations, costing thousands of lives, and teaching future historians that if you mix too much pride, power, and entitlement, you don't get greatness. You get the 12th century. Now, let's drift over to France, where the Bourbons were often less murderous, but far more performative. The feud between Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, and his nobility wasn't technically a war, but it was definitely a spectacle. Louis had grown up during the Fronde, a series of aristocratic rebellions that terrified him as a child. So, when he came to power, he decided to deal with the nobility in his own gentle, psychological way, by forcing them all to live with him. At Versailles, Louis turned politics into performance art. Nobles spent hours waiting for the chance to hand him his shirt in the morning or hold his candle at night. The closer you were to his royal socks, the more powerful you were. Naturally, this led to incredible levels of backstabbing, whispering, and petty feuding, all over who got to stand 2 feet closer to the king's left elbow. Louis, of course, loved every minute, because controlling his nobles through vanity was infinitely safer than fighting them in open rebellion. The result? Decades of extravagance, endless etiquette, and the slow, graceful decline of French aristocracy, all because one man decided that being adored was more fun than being overthrown. Next, we can drift a little north, to Scotland, where royal feuds tended to involve more actual weapons and fewer chandeliers. The Stuart dynasty was spirited, let's say. One of the most striking examples was James II of Scotland, who as a child king watched various noble families tear the country apart in a game of who can control the throne today. By the time he came of age, James had had enough. He invited one of his most troublesome rivals, William, 8th Earl of Douglas, to dinner. They ate, they drank, they talked. Then James stabbed him. Repeatedly. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. Unfortunately, it also sparked yet another feud between the crown and the Douglas family that would last decades. Because when a royal dinner ends with the host murdering the guest, it tends to ruin relations. James himself eventually died when a cannon exploded in his face. Which, in a darkly poetic way, feels like the perfect metaphor for Scottish royal politics at the time: loud, explosive, and entirely self-inflicted. Let's drift eastward now, toward Russia, where family feuds reached Shakespearean levels of dysfunction. The Romanovs managed to turn pettiness into statecraft. Take Peter the Great, who spent his youth feuding with his half-sister Sophia, his half-brother Ivan, and most of Moscow. Sophia had ruled as regent before Peter came of age, and she was not thrilled when he decided to take over. After some fighting, including a few public executions, because it was Russia, Peter seized control. He modernized the empire, built St. Petersburg, and declared himself emperor. And, naturally, he also tortured and executed his own son, Alexei, for suspected treason. Because nothing says strong family values like personally ordering your child's interrogation. Centuries later, the Romanovs were still at it. By the time of Nicholas II, cousin feuds had expanded to international scale. Nicholas was first cousins with both Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and King George V of Britain. Which meant that when World War I broke out, it was, essentially, a family argument that killed millions. Dinner must have been awkward that Christmas. And then, of course, there were the Habsburgs, Europe's most famous practitioners of inbreeding and intermarriage, who managed to feud mostly with themselves. For centuries, the Habsburg motto might as well have been, "Marry, don't fight." But when you marry enough cousins, eventually you start fighting anyway, usually over who gets to keep the same crown. One of the strangest episodes came in the 16th century, when Charles V ruled both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, while his brother Ferdinand I ruled Austria. They were supposed to cooperate. Instead, they spent years quietly undermining each other's power, refusing to share resources, and writing passive-aggressive letters about military strategy. When Charles finally abdicated, he retired to a monastery, tired, gout-ridden, and, presumably, ready for some peace. His descendants did not learn from his example. The family continued intermarrying and feuding for generations, until poor Charles II of Spain arrived, the final, overbred heir who could barely chew, much less rule. It was perhaps the ultimate example of a feud gone too far, one that ended not in victory, but in genetic collapse. And so, as we drift toward the end of tonight's royal parade of grievances, it's worth noting that for all their crowns, castles, and titles, Europe's monarchs often behaved like children fighting over a toy no one actually wanted to share. Some wars began over insults. Some over marriages. Some simply because one cousin looked at another cousin the wrong way at a coronation. But behind it all was the same quiet, human truth. Even the most powerful people in history could not escape the urge to be petty. To feel slighted. To want to win an argument, no matter the cost. And, as history gently reminds us, sometimes those arguments lasted centuries. So, as you drift off tonight, imagine a great hall filled with velvet robes, heavy crowns, and cousins glaring across the table. Somewhere, a candle flickers. Someone sighs dramatically. And somewhere else, a scribe is already recording the first line of yet another pointless war. Sleep well. And remember, history's most impressive feuds were, at their core, just very expensive tantrums, forgotten royals who tried and failed to matter. Hey everyone. Welcome back. If you're still awake, that's completely fine. This part of the story isn't about excitement. It's about, well, quiet disappointment. Tonight, we're drifting softly through the faded pages of history, to visit those poor souls who were born royal, crowned in silk and ceremony, and then promptly forgotten. They had titles, they had tutors, they had portraits that made them look far more important than they were. But history, in its polite way, just sort of looked past them. So if you've ever had a day where you felt underappreciated, take comfort. Some kings and queens ruled entire kingdoms, and still left less of a mark than a spilled ink blot on a court document. Let's begin our drowsy tour of the royally irrelevant. Our first stop is King Louis XIX of France, who, technically, ruled for about 20 minutes. Yes, 20. It was 1830. His father, Charles X, had just been forced to abdicate after a series of disastrous political decisions that managed to alienate almost everyone in France, which, at the time, was saying something. Louis, as the dutiful son, inherited the throne. He accepted it, probably sighed, and began preparing to rule. Then, almost immediately, he abdicated too, in favor of his nephew, the Duke of Bordeaux. So, Louis XIX went down in history as the man who ruled for less time than it takes to boil an egg. He lived the rest of his life in quiet exile, surrounded by other exiled royals, reminiscing about the golden days of monarchy while eating dinners funded by European cousins who didn't want him coming back. It's not the worst ending, really. Just a long, polite fade into obscurity, the royal version of quietly deleting your social media account. Let's drift north now, to England, and meet King Athelred the Unready. Though to be fair, Unready doesn't quite capture the full scale of the problem. Athelred ruled at the turn of the first millennium, a stressful time, with constant Viking raids and people convinced the world was about to end. He became king as a child, and his court was run by advisors who were not exactly competent. So when the Vikings came, Athelred panicked. He paid them to leave. They took the money and came back for more. Eventually, they just stayed. Athelred fled the country. Then, in a truly medieval display of optimism, he returned a few years later and tried again. It didn't go any better. History remembered him not as evil or tyrannical, just hopelessly ineffective. Like a man trying to bail out a sinking ship with a sieve. He died in 1016, leaving behind a reputation so uninspiring that even his name became shorthand for royal confusion. Still, there's something quietly tragic about Athelred. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't cruel. He just couldn't get it together. And honestly, we've all had years like that. From there, let's drift east to Russia, where forgotten royalty came with fur coats and frostbite. One of the most quietly tragic figures in the long, icy lineage of the Romanovs was Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, the younger brother of Tsar Nicholas II. When Nicholas was forced to abdicate in 1917, Michael technically became Tsar for one full day. He didn't want to. He said he'd only accept the throne if the people of Russia actually wanted him to, which, as it turned out, they didn't. So instead, he just didn't. The country slipped further into chaos, and Michael lived quietly for a while before being executed by the Bolsheviks. His short reign, if you can even call it that, was marked not by power, but by hesitation. By the realization that sometimes, the crown isn't worth the headache. There's a kind of melancholy grace in that. A man born to rule, choosing not to. And, in a strange way, perhaps he was the wisest Romanov of them all. Now, let's visit Spain, where there was once a queen who reigned, abdicated, returned, and still somehow vanished from historical memory, Queen Isabella II. She came to the throne as a child, under the guidance of advisors who treated the country's politics like a badly written soap opera. Isabella grew up surrounded by court intrigues, coups, and endless arguments over who she should marry. The lucky winner was her cousin, Francis of Cadiz, who may or may not have been more interested in his wardrobe than his wife. Their marriage produced several children, though most historians suspect not all of them were his. Eventually, Isabella was overthrown, fled the country, and lived in Paris for decades. She spent her later years attending social gatherings, eating pastries, and writing mildly scandalous letters to old friends. When she finally died, few in Spain noticed. Her legacy was overshadowed by louder, flashier monarchs, and her name slipped quietly off the edges of the history books. Which, given how much drama she endured, might have been a mercy. If we float gently north again, we'll find Queen Christina of Sweden, the 17th century monarch who famously decided she'd rather do anything else than rule a kingdom. Christina was brilliant, eccentric, and utterly uninterested in what her council expected of her. She read philosophy, collected art, refused to marry, and occasionally dressed like a man just to see how people would react. Eventually, she abdicated, packed her things, converted to Catholicism, and moved to Rome, where she spent the rest of her life attending plays, hosting salons, and mildly annoying the Pope. The Swedes never quite forgave her. She's remembered more as a curiosity than a ruler, the queen who walked away. And yet, for someone forgotten, she lived a fuller, freer life than many who clung desperately to their thrones. Perhaps she didn't fail to matter at all, she just mattered in a quieter, stranger way.